And a bad morning to you. It is 8 o'clock on 7/20, 20th of July, 2018. This is the fourth episode of Bad Morning News. It would be the fifth episode, but Monday was a little bit too rocky for that. But largely, this is a show, and this is probably the last time I'm going to say this. But this is a show designed to be the alternative to morning news. It's a show that's looking for anchors if you want to be one and talk all the terrible things that people should be thinking about while they go to work. Let me know. But basically, that's the idea. The morning news wants to cow you into submission. They want to make you a slave. They want to make you a cog in the machine, and they want to make you vulnerable to their little suggestions that that everything is fine, that everything is going great, and just let them keep control. When that's bullshit. So this is your antidote to that. So without further ado, let's just do housekeeping. Fucking brought to you by Brave, the ad resistant, track resistant browsing experience. You give me $5 worth of basic attention tokens just by signing up for free, and it's a relatively good browsing experience. Better than the one I'm using right now to do this, by the way, because fucking Vivaldi sucks ass through a straw. In more ways than one. I used to like it a lot, but now I do not, because it fucking crashes like it did before this thing happened. But aside from all that, you can also get the Cash app, which is a Federal Reserve note and Bitcoin wallet that you can use with a Visa card that comes associated with it. And also Liberty mugs, which you can use to piss off your coworkers while also consuming fluids. But I guess then we'll move on to introductions. This will probably be the last time we do this too. We'll be going by names now. So Lupinate, why don't you introduce yourself and let people know where they can find you and what you do.
Hi everybody, I'm Lupinate. You can find me on Minds or Discord as Lupinate, and on Steemit as an Arctic Wolf. I mainly write about reality, logic, and voluntarism, and do a fair bit of debating. And we were kind of hoping, I think, to make this episode a bit of a call-out episode, get people to provide some articles that they wanted reporting, and I figured I should call it out to the chat if anybody's got anything they want us to particularly talk about. Send us a link.
Right. So on that level, this is a community episode, and we should be doing community episodes every Friday. And if you want us to cover a topic, it doesn't matter if it's Friday or not, you can still send it. But if we don't get to it, we'll talk about it Friday. And if you want it covered on specifically the community episode, then let us know, and we'll cover that on Friday when we cover all the other community stuff. So let's get into the first one, the one about Israel apartheid approves nationality apartheid law. Let's get into that. How about you take that away for now?
All right, mate. Hang on a sec. I'll pull it up. So this is, I believe, off of TelesurTV.net. And I'm trying to get it to orient here. There we go. Israel approves national, quote, apartheid law. Controversial law states only Jewish people have the right to self-determination in the state of Israel, denying the right to 1.8 million Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship. Israel's parliament, the Knesset, approved the controversial national bill Thursday, declaring Israel a nation-state for the Jewish people and downgrading the status of Arabic from official language to special status. Arabs make up 21% of the Israeli population. The basic law, approved with 62 votes in favor and 55 against, recognizes the Jewish people in Israel have a, quote, have an exclusive right to national self-determination. It also includes the declaration of a, quote, united Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, despite the fact East Jerusalem is internationally recognized as being under Israeli occupation. Furthermore, the law affirms, quote, the state sees the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. 122 years after Herzl, the father of Zionism, published his vision, we enshrined into law the basic principle of our existence, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, praising the law. I think they meant to say praising. Legislator Avi Dikta of the ruling Likud party, which also sponsored the bill, explained, we are enshrining this important bill into a law today to prevent even the slightest thought, let alone attempt, to transform Israel into a country of all its citizens. Zion Union leader Tzipi Livni argued, and that's probably a bad pronunciation, so my apologies, argued the bill sought to strengthen Netanyahu. Netanyahu wants the bill in order to fight. Otherwise, how will people know he is more of a nationalist than you, she said. Arab lawmakers protested the bill's approval, arguing it is a codification of apartheid and ripping papers in a symbolic gesture, which prompted Knesset Speaker Yuli Edelstein to remove them from the plenum. Legislator Ahmad Tibi and Aida, Tuma Suleiman yelled at Netanyahu, you passed an apartheid law, a racist law. I announced with shock and sorrow the death of democracy, Ahmed Tibi told reporters. Lawmaker Amin Oda, chairman of the Joint List, released a statement saying that Israel passed a law of Jewish supremacy and told us that we will always be second-class citizens. Around 1.8 million Arabs live in Israel, and they are the descendants of the Palestinians who remained in what is today Israel after the 1948 War of Independence. Jewish Israeli peace activists also protested the bill by unfurling a large black flag in the Knesset. Moments ago, and there's a tweet from Peace Now Israel that shows them unveiling what looks like a giant black shawl, to be honest, behind a glass panel. About 3 or 4 people. Anyway, the Adalah Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel released a statement Thursday dubbing the bill a, quote, colonial law with features of apartheid. It creates various avenues for segregation in land and housing and incentives based on the principle of advancing Jewish settlement, both in civil life and in obtaining citizenship based on the law of return, and in language and in cultural rights in the name of self-definition. Arab citizens of Israel and Haaretz journalist Yanan Sol responded to the bill's approval, quoting a saying in Arabic, water only turns clear after it's been muddy. To be honest, I'm happy this law passed. This is exposing the dirty. It shows the degree to which Israel thinks it's doing its Palestinian citizens a favor. So, and that's the end of the article. So it's raw. Okay, well, at least you're being honest about it now.
Well, and honestly, like, okay, so this is a little bit of libertarian inside baseball, whatever. Even though I sort of hate that term. Christopher Chase Rachel's put up a picture yesterday, of like with numbers hooked up to it, of like this chocolate gorilla dissolving in milk, and the picture was an implication that that it was a numerical equation that could be done to determine how much the introduction of brown people lowered the general IQ level of a multicultural society. Meaning, and you know, people can call this an oversimplification and call me a cuck if they want, but meaning that he's dumb. Meaning that like whoever made that image, if it wasn't him, was dumb. Because like, and also, by the way, his book was basically like entirely cucked to the right, entirely. So there's that part too. But then there's the like this normal idea now, this normalized idea that one race is better than the other. Like,
Hello?
acceptable from many different parties. What?
Cut out there for a second, right?
Okay, well, what I was gonna say, what I was saying is that racism has become acceptable from many different parties under the guise of being like, you know, the acceptable form of it. Like whether it's like this IQ thing or the We Was Kangs thing or, you know, any number of other things, it's suddenly acceptable to say that your race is the best without actually proving that you make it better or without actually proving that it's better at all. You know, I mean, they love to throw around statistics, but those statistics are going to change and rapidly and regularly. So those statistics based on breeding, especially given the fact that if that was the case, the homogeneity that these people claim to think is bad, if it comes from a mix, that would have to be examined later on in order to make sure that that was the case, and then it would have to be like reflected against the stats of like how these people use their intelligence, if they use their intelligence in terms of who they bred with or why, or the fact that like maybe they expose their children to phthalates, maybe fucking countless other obstacles in the way of their spawn becoming intelligent, especially in this hyper industrial society which pumps out things that are very bad for people. um you know, there's countless things in the way of these sorts of things being valid and valuable. But you know, and that was probably a very clunky way to phrase it too, like I'll admit
There's a.
that. But
Sorry, I thought you cut out, mate, because I'm moving around a little bit, but it kind of reminds me of that "This Land Is Mine" sketch
yeah.
that was done back in 2012 with all of the various groups of Arabs and Israelis and all the historic groups as well, like the British, the Romans, etc., trying to conquer the land of Israel, and the only one really conquering it is death. Because he's the one who always rears his ugly head at the end of the cycle as everything's being blown up. And this, I mean, to be honest, this isn't surprising. This has been probably on the cards for a long time, and it's only now that they've got enough votes to make it carry, kind of thing. From my point of view, it's just more collectivism, just a different flavor. There's so much of it in the world nowadays that it beggars belief, and I'm starting to see people waking up to realizing that it doesn't actually work, and as a result, a lot of the group statistics have little value. They have meaning, but have no real value in running an analysis beyond something very superficial. And they have no value in of themselves, because race can be a determinant for your IQ, your affluence, etc. But it also might not be, and other factors come to play. And because it's a multi-factor analysis, and nobody bothers doing factor analysis themselves, unless they are statisticians, they don't understand how many other factors could come into play, which ones have the most priority, and to be quite frank, nobody really knows the answer to this right now. It's one thing intersectionality proved was you can delineate a group almost an infinite number of indescribable ways until there are more groups than there are people. It's very easy to do. You don't even need that many different types of thing to calculate. 100, and you've already well exceeded the processing power that would be required to calculate the number of combinations, which would be in well excess of what is on planet Earth. So there, unless you're going to calculate for every single individual, it's meaningless to calculate for groups.
Well, you know, it has some value, but only if you're willing to prove somehow that your sample size is representative of that group. If you can take enough people from enough swaths, that you're not just like essentially cherry picking your data before you even collect it, then that could have some value. But a lot of these quote studies fail to recognize that a lot of like the other races haven't even taken the IQ test, or they were raised in underfunded education systems that didn't teach them the basic pattern recognition that it would take to even pass the IQ test. And that's true of a lot of poor whites too, which is why I like fucking Body Counts No Lives Matter. That song is fucking great because they say that it's not really about race, it's about class and the amount of money you have.
To some extent, that's true. Affluence has a huge role. IQ has a huge role, and they are interconnected and cyclically linked. But again, people then go, well, racial groups have variances in IQ. And it's like, yes, but it really doesn't matter because those are traits. They describe things. It's like saying labels have agency. It just doesn't work. You can't make those arguments and expect them to stick.
Well, especially since when you make that sort of argument and try to get it to stick, you're basically saying fuck the actually intelligent ones. We're going to talk about like, you know, the ones that we don't like to make our point. And that to me is the worst way to go about it if you're actually being genuine for wanting a better society, because what you really should be saying is it doesn't matter what race you are. If you're intelligent and ethical, please breed. You know, and try to outbreed the people who are neither or, you know, neither of both. So I mean, the real thing here in this particular piece is that you shouldn't have to be like a special classification for being like the language speaker in the place where your essentially ethnic group was for the majority of life. And you certainly shouldn't have to for like a state that hasn't even existed for 100 years to come in and create a new sort of super class. And the whole idea of Israel to begin with has a huge amount of problems, not the least of which is the Zionism, which is why the person who brought this to our attention wants us to bring this up. You know, there's a map that people can freely find on the internet where you can see where it started in the 60s and where like it's sort of virally spread ever since, where you can see the giant splotch of color become more and more homogenous, take little chunks from different places, and not leave Palestine alone at all, not give them any agency. And then like suddenly the apartheid is made honest by saying that, hey, if you're an Arab and you speak you know, a language that we don't like, you're essentially a second-class citizen. And it's like, oh well, yeah, but we're just clarifying the waters here by making them muddy. Like, really dumb people.
It's, oh, I don't know. It's one of those. Israel is something that Britain doesn't really pay too much attention to beyond the current Palestinian conflict. It's not, and it's a bit more balanced over here. It's tends to be a little bit more pro-Palestine because, to be quite frank, Britain has had a better relationship with Arab nations than America ever had. Largely because they helped keep them cemented when the Arab Empire was there. So, and they did a lot of trade as a result. But those nations, they accepted Israel was going to be there up to a point. And then when Israel started basically waging war on its neighbors, all of them quickly realized this probably isn't going to stop anytime soon. And we're going to need to counteract it as much as possible. And that's why there's such a conflict and such a problem with travel. If you're trying to get to Israel, you can't go through certain countries, as Jeremy Clarkson and co. found out when they tried to do it. They had to basically go around certain nations and backtrack through one country and another, all because they were in another country and they had a stamp in their passport saying as much. So it's a catch-22 situation. They are very isolationist as a result.
Well, right. And um, this sort of thing has been going on for a really long time. So long, in fact, that essentially the divide could be like a result of post World War II money, because if you remember, Hitler sympathized with Palestine, and not to say that that's like something fantastic to have on your resumes that Hitler sympathized with you, but the reason he did is because he saw the way that the Jews were treating them, um, and there were actually large numbers of people who agreed with him across the aisle. It was sort of one of the bipartisan supports he had before the entire thing went under, or tits up, as many people might say. And like the whole idea of a mandatory Palestine was there, where like Palestinians would be able to stay Palestinians through the support of Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany would do that in exchange for essentially a hegemonic opposition to Jewry. And while I might not agree with that as a tactic, and while I'm an anarchist and rah rah, um, the points that were made about it were relatively solid. They just came to the wrong conclusions, in my opinion. So this has been going on for much longer than this. They've just sort of begun the process of finalizing it.
And you'd think that a nation that basically was created because of endless persecution would have the ability to have some introspection on perhaps both why they were persecuted and also how they should act in future so that they don't repeat the mistakes of the people that harmed them, if that makes sense. I mean, you shouldn't repeat the mistakes of other people if you see them make mistakes. I think everybody can agree what was done in Germany was a mistake. And yet it seems, given some of the reports from basically non-Zionistic Israelis, of which there are quite a few, there's a lot of concern that the Israeli government hasn't learnt those lessons, and that the Israeli government is determined to repeat those mistakes rather than correct for them.
Right. And not to mention the fact that essentially, like when you have a system like this, and people can't even speak their own language, it destroys the culture that's associated with that language, which is what that's for. So
yeah, precisely. I mean, and the fact of the matter is why have Israeli citizenship if you're an Arab? If you're going to be treated as a lesser citizen, go to some place where you won't. It's a deliberate tactic to drive people away.
Yeah, because that's why the if you don't like it, leave argument is always dumb, because it's like, well, there's only so many places I can leave to, especially since they have aerial, drones, fucking making me afraid of the sky.
It's not even a logical argument, though. People like to think it is, but it isn't. It's historically, it's basically the traitorous critic argument. The idea that, oh, you are saying bad things about our nation, therefore you shouldn't be in our nation. That is the logic that gets presented, and it's not logic; it's fallacious reasoning. It's just an insult.
Well, and not to mention the fact that it's also like it's saying I'm not going to actually discuss what you're saying. I'm just going to, throw it away. It doesn't matter what you're saying because you disagree with my core premise, which is that, whatever this place is fantastic. It's basically, and I say these words a lot, but, I truly believe that it boils down to like xenophobia and jingoism, specifically jingoism, where you believe that just your country is the most fantastic, blah, 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 and you get a dopamine rush from feeling fantastic about it, so you keep on doing it even if, it doesn't require any thought to do it. blah blah, all this stuff, and ignore the global numbers, ignore the general IQ rates, ignore the workforce participation rates, ignore the unemployment and homelessness and suicide and depression and blah blah, in order to say that America's the best, or that whatever America supports is the best, in this case Israel, because that's where a lot of Israeli support comes from. So
yeah, no, it reminds me to some extent of there's a series that was over here called Psycho Bitches, where they took women out of history and basically psychoanalyzed them. And it was a comedy series with a bit of an artsy fartsy feel to it. And they did a pillory of Maggie Thatcher as basically being treated as Hannibal Lecter in a prison. And one of the bits where she was talking was, it's wonderful for me, and because she was saying how wonderful it is to be rich and wealthy where other people weren't, and the therapist said, yes, but it wouldn't be wonderful for me. Yes, but it's wonderful for me. You cannot get away from that individual. You cannot get away from the fact that if it's good for you, sod everybody else in most situations. And that is what the state will do. It basically has to pander to its base. And if it wants its base to be one thing all the time, then that's what it's going to create. And they've tried to do it elsewhere. They're trying to do it here in Britain to some extent, normalizing a bunch of things that probably shouldn't be normalized. And they've officially done it in Israel now.
Yeah, well, and do you have an example of some of those things that shouldn't be normalized? I can buffer this conversation with something if you need to look for a link.
Let me see what I can find. Let's circle around back to that. I'll have a quick look around. You do one now, mate, so that I can have a bit of time to look through.
Okay. Well, I'm opening up this one from Zero Hedge, and it's Bitcoin, blockchain, and the reordering of political and financial power. Crypto blockchain technologies are leveraging the potential of computers and the web for direct political and social innovation. We're accustomed to three basic templates for system-wide solutions or improvements. An individual builds a better mousetrap and starts a company to exploit this competitive advantage. And this is, by the way, authored by Charles Hugh Smith of Two Minds blog. 2, a company invents something that spawns a new industry, the photocopier, the web browser, for example, and or disrupts existing business models. The central government decrees a strategy or investment, i.e. makes something happen. The interstate highway system in the 1950s, the space race to the moon in the 1960s, for example. I don't think any of these templates really captures the eventual impact of cryptocurrencies and blockchains, which I define broadly as any decentralized distributed ledger. As for the better mousetrap, the creators of Bitcoin explicitly designed a form of money that they reckoned was superior to centrally controlled fiat currency. A decentralized form of money that isn't borrowed into existence like fiat currency is centrally revolutionary, but that is only one aspect of the crypto blockchain technology. Since Bitcoin and the blockchain technology behind it aren't owned by a corporation, the template of a company benefiting from disrupting existing business models, for example, Apple's iPod, iTunes, and iPhone, doesn't fit. It's certainly true that cryptos and blockchain are spawning a new industry, much like microprocessors and digital memory launched the computer revolution and the World Wide Web and its protocols launched the internet revolution. But there are between 1,600 and 1,900 cryptocurrencies and tokens based on them, and hundreds of enterprises are developing applications for blockchain and related technologies. The difference between these old technologies and the crypto blockchain technologies is these have explicit social and political applications and ramifications, consequences that cannot be mapped onto consumer product innovation or process innovations, such as increasing computational power. These technologies have the potential to reorder the structure and processes of governance and social relations. In this way, crypto blockchain tech is leveraging the potential of computers and the web for direct political social innovation. Here's an example described in an email to me from Decred's lead developer, Jake Yokampiat, of a software platform that is not connected to a cryptocurrency that could be applied in the kinds of decentralized governance, community development, guaranteed paid work, and markets that I describe in my CLIMB system, community labor integrated money economy. The big idea with Politeia was to create a time-anchored file system with a minimal on-chain footprint, so you can be certain that the information in the file system existed on or before a particular date. Additionally, it includes the identity data so that person entity X can attest to data Y at time Z in a way that cannot be altered after the fact. I felt that having a plain old website for our governance system wasn't sufficiently censorship resistant. As I expect you can see, Politeia is an incredibly generic tool, and you can make use of it without holding any Decred. This sort of distributed ledger, stripped to the computational weight of the blockchain, could power community democracy. The distribution of a labor-backed currency, as I describe in my book, A Radically Beneficial World, and render market could recommend render market transactions transparent to all participants. These applications don't enrich a corporation, they reorder the power structure of the economy and society. So there's a small amount more and some charts that everybody should look at, so the link will be in the description. But effectively, what he's saying is that once you start to make a trustless system, you start to get a society that is resistant to outside control, that can't be like isolated and stripped of its power.
The blockchain, pardon me, the blockchain is one of the most incredible technologies of our day. It's going to be the combination of the blockchain, graphene, and quantum computing, I think, which is really coming along quite quickly now. Is going to revolutionize society beyond any measurable amount, in my expectation. It will be a geometric level of expansion, not just an exponential one. It's going to go nuclear, basically, from an economic perspective. And that's a good thing, because it means that everybody has a chance to really make a contribution.
Yeah, I should have muted my mic. I felt that coming, but anyway, fucking yeah. And the cool thing about the blockchain is that anybody can have a copy. That's what's cool. Like, so, like it's like an instantly updating version of the way the world looks, instead of one that you have to trust somebody else's assessment of. Like, that's what banks do. They trade ledgers too, but they trade ledgers that only they have access to. And in doing so, they prevent the public from having any accountability that they could hold them to, much less any accountability that they would hold themselves to. And as a result, the fractional reserve system can essentially rob the world.
Precisely. I mean, one of the key things about the blockchain that people don't understand is it's not that it's supposed to be invisible transactions. It's supposed to be 100% visible. That's basically the way it works. A lot of people think, oh, it's only criminals who use Bitcoin and things like that. And no, the main people who now use Bitcoin are probably investors and speculators. And it's not really that useful for criminal activity, just for ease of transactional flow, because you know that these two accounts transacted a piece of money. You don't necessarily know what that is for with the currency alone, but with a ledger of distribution, with a ledger for delivery, with a ledger for anything to do with logistics, you're able to work that out. And that creates other jobs. That's the other beautiful thing, is people can then have a job just reviewing those transactions to make sure that they fit within a certain set of criteria for their certification.
Well,
and it makes that so much easier.
And let's be specific. The current economy is getting ever more tyrannical, and so having a system like this, which prevents the elites from essentially being able to centrally control the thing, is very valuable. Like, There's a link that I just got sent in a group message that I'm on Twitter, and that link is to an IRS page about a relatively new fucking program, and it says revocation or denial of passport in case of certain unpaid taxes, and it says if you've been seriously delinquent if you have seriously delinquent tax debt, IRS section 7345 authorizes the IRS to certify that debt to the State Department for action. The State Department generally will not issue a passport to you after receiving certification from the IRS. Upon receiving certification, the State Department shall deny your passport application and or may revoke your current passport. If your passport application is denied or your passport revoked and you are overseas, the State Department may issue you a limited validity passport good only for direct return to the U.S. Certification of individuals with seriously delinquent tax debt. Seriously delinquent tax debt is an individual's unpaid legally enforceable federal tax debt totaling more than $51K, including interest and penalties, for which a notice of federal tax lien has been filed and all administrative remedies under IRC section 6320 have lapsed or been exhausted, or levy has been issued. Seriously delinquent tax debt is limited to liabilities incurred under Title 26 of the fucking USC, United States Code, and does not include debts collected by the IRS, such as the FBAR penalty and child support. Some tax debt is not included in determining seriously delinquent tax debt, even if it meets the above criteria. It includes tax debt being paid timely with an IRS-approved installed agreement, being paid timely with an offer in compromise accepted by the IRS, or a settlement agreement entered within the Justice Department. Fucking my eyes are blown a little. For which a collection due process hearing is timely requested regarding a levy to collect the debt, or for which collection has been suspended because request for innocent spouse relief under IRC 6015 has been made. Additionally, a passport won't be a risk under this program for any taxpayer who's in bankruptcy, who's identified by the IRS as a victim of tax-related identity theft, whose account the IRS has determined is currently not collectible due to hardship, who is located within a federally declared disaster area, who has a request pending with the IRS for an installment agreement, who has a pending offer in compromise with the IRS, or who has an IRS accepted adjustment that will satisfy the debt in full. Certification will be postponed while an individual is serving in a designated combat zone or participating in a contingency operation. Before denying a passport, the State Department will hold your application for 90 days to allow you to resolve any erroneous certification issues, make full payment of the tax debt, enter a satisfactory agreement with the IRS. So,
please stop.
then they have a fucking thing about adjustment for inflation. They have like a thing about like judicial review of the certification, so like you can possibly sue them for your status being reversed. But
yeah, what do you get for that?
Well,
can you sue for like emotional damages in the millions? And if so, who's paying for that? The taxpayer.
Well, right, and then double that, by the way, because like, okay, so we were talking, if you don't like it, leave. Well, maybe I don't like it because I don't like being stolen from, and I'm trying to get away from that. So I have 90 days to either move to a disaster area, fucking like get my identity stolen, go bankrupt, fucking like get into a severe car accident so that I can say I'm in a hardship, fucking just break myself so that the IRS doesn't like mean
break
that I
you
can't.
For you.
Yeah, mean that I can't leave this place.
And
fucking 90 days.
Think about us overseas. I mean, I know that there are a lot of Americans out there who just don't file. And if they don't file, then that's technically against the law. Now, you can file now, apparently, and declare that you're not going to pay any tax because of XYZ policies. And you can basically say, I'm not giving you anything because you're paying for these things. And technically, courts have actually allowed that to go through in the States. But the US system is one for taxes in particular is one of the weirdest in the world. There's only one other like it, and that's Eritrea, which has been a war-torn nation for decades. So to be quite frank, the fact that America decided to take their law of expat taxation and apply it universally so that even international banks now have to record anyone who's an American citizen, any transactions they make, and report them to the IRS under FACTA. Now, this law particularly pissed off every single expat because we already pay taxes to the nation we're in. So we're now being asked to pay taxes to two nations at once if we're making a certain amount of money, and at least file so that we can prove that we don't make that amount of money. And we don't actually necessarily have to pay into the system even, because we might not make enough money in whatever country we're in to qualify. But because of that, we still have to waste the time filing the taxes, sending them on. We still have to do all of the things that infuriate everybody when they do taxes. And if we ever make a sale of something, it could be years before we actually get a notification that this needs to be paid for on tax. So it's really one of the worst situations you can be in as an expat. And because you can't there's no way you can get your money away from the US. If you make a certain amount, you're going to pay tax on it. And if you don't make that amount, then you don't. And technically, you might even qualify for things like a rebate if you lost money in the stock market. So,
yeah, well, and then like add to all that the fact that essentially when they do this sort of thing, they're creating the world as their potential tax farm. And people think they're fucking free. That's the most hilarious part of it. Like they think this is a free country.
People like to say, if you don't like it, you're free to leave. And I go, no, you're not. You actually have to pay an exit fee. There are charges that you have to pay for to actually renounce your citizenship. There's a number of things that you have to actually go through to get rid of your citizenship and go somewhere else. Right. Plus, there's all the hassle of actually getting the visas, getting the citizenship in another country. I mean, I've gotten the visas. They're a pain in the ass. The citizenship, after getting certain ones, is actually quite easy, comparatively speaking. But at that point, you're locked in. You are voluntarily agreeing, this is the system I want to follow. So, swings and roundabouts, really.
Yeah, well, and let's so that's actually a reasonably good place to switch back to the other subject, because you said that Britain was normalizing things in their country too that were relatively absurd.
It is. I mean, things like normalizing the concept of terrorism, for example. Now, this is a very old concept, but technically it is valid because the London mayor, who's still mayor today, back in 2016, said that being prepared for terror attacks is part and parcel of, believes the threat of terror attacks are part and parcel of living in a big city. Now, that statement alone basically means expect terrorism. You should always be aware of terrorism. It's somewhat common sense stuff, but it is normalization of the idea in people's minds so that they're more accepting of it. In addition to that, it's things like the normalization of an entire group amongst subgroups. So take, for example, the, quote, Asian grooming gangs, unquote, that have been affecting areas like Telford and Rotherham. Now, if you were to say that nobody in the Sikh community would agree that it's them, nobody in the Chinese community would agree it's them, nobody in the Indian community would probably agree it's them. In fact, there's one specific subset that most people would say it is, including the victims. And I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to be arrested. And that is the other thing. They're normalizing the concept that it's okay to fine people for talking. These things are not right. These things are antithetical to how society has evolved. And the fact that we're embracing them over here with such vehemence is really alarming to me. Now, at the same time, I see the other side who are arguing alongside me, saying, this is stupid. We need to have free speech. We need to be able to say things that are controversial in order to change people's ideas of how the world actually works. And this is something that is actually growing in support over here rapidly. UKIP has become basically the UK Freedom Party to some extent because they're advocating for free speech, freedom from Europe, freedom from a lot of different things, giving themselves some self-determination again. And they are growing at such a rate that the people who are actually processing their applications have a huge backlog to go through, which is incredible. The poll shift has basically gone, I think it was from like 4% to 12 or 8 in a week since Sargon and co all jumped on the UKIP bandwagon. There is a sea change happening. I'm quietly confident of that. It's just going to have to be really shouted at the rooftops, and people are going to actually have to demand debates about this issue. And to have the government to stop basically just saying platitudes that have no value whatsoever to any kind of political discourse, which is what they do right now.
Well, and of course, debate isn't sufficient. I mean, there's been debate for, decades now about certain policies that haven't seen any change. Well, okay, yeah, I mean, maybe an intellectual debate, but don't try to debate with power. Try to debate with your mind. Like, holy shit. People think that a healthy economy of debate creates any other sort of healthy economy where people can argue about it, sure, but can they do anything about it? Probably not. Those people are the reason Britain's the way it is. I mean, as far as I can see, this is an outside perspective.
I disagree from the inside. It's the people who are winning those debates in the public eye.
Are they winning them, though?
Some of them are, I'd say, yeah, definitely. Because look at the Jordan Peterson interview. Look at the Jordan Peterson interview with Cathy Newman. Who do you think won that particular tete-a-tete?
I'm talking about debate over policy.
I see. Well, no, to some extent, there is a policy debate within that, but I get your point. It's more not as a principle, but as an implementation strategy. Is there proper debate going on there?
Well, yeah, and like
it's a good question.
The fact that like there's always this like rub hullabaloo in the parliament about fucking whatever policy comes out, and like the politicians and it's similar for the U.S. Senate, by the way. I'm not just like saying this is exclusive to Britain, but where the politicians will argue with each other, and the collective citizenry will take one of their sides without actually like knowing full well what the issues are, or without having any way to actually influence it if the issues directly affect them in a way that they don't like. So the debate happens and people take a side but the debate happens and people take a side in the debate, but like ultimately that debate is worthless if it doesn't actually have the potential to produce change.
True. And the real problem over here, I find, is that even when people make valid arguments in Parliament, often if the majority party has a proper majority and they aren't divided on the issue, they'll just get laughed out of the debate. Basically, you'll get really stupid arguments that are basically high school level bullshit, and it's hilarious to watch BBC Parliament sometimes because when they get really rowdy, they just descend into name calling. There is no statesmanship there when they really get going. And it's just, how erudite can I be when I throw this insulting quip at you? And then everybody will laugh at me. Ha ha ha. It's really nothing. There's really nothing to it. I don't understand how you can spend like years learning how to be a politician. And then that's what it is. For Christ's sake, I had that in high school.
Well, and when you have these career politicians, they're not incentivized to change anything at all in the end. They can just keep on going up there debating and making a reputation for being somebody strong enough to yell at somebody across a room. They don't have any incentive to change. That's a fairly cushy job.
Precisely. And they had even less incentive to change when the expense scandal happened way back when.
Describe that for the people who aren't familiar.
So this is quite a few years ago, and it still has left its mark on British politics, to be honest. A few years back, around when freedom of information came to Britain as a policy, and Blair very quickly, it was back in the Blair days, and he very quickly regretted doing this because people started asking for information about MP expenses, and it was deemed a state secret. So they started filing freedom of information requests on them. And very quickly, it had to go to the courts, where it hung about for years and years and years until Blair was pretty much, I think, out of office at the time, and Gordon Brown was in charge by then. And what wound up happening was, when the scandal finally broke and the court said, nope, this can be allowed to be seen, things like duck ponds, Twix bars, and snacks that people were buying in the like the commissary at the Parliament or wherever it is, everything was basically being expensed. The entire lifestyle of an MP was effectively on the taxpayer's dime. But the really big expenses actually managed to get a few politicians put in prison for fraud, because they weren't supposed to be doing this. This was against parliamentary rules. This was against every rule that was there. And that's why they were trying to keep it covered up. And heads did roll. Not any huge ones, because they were probably quite clever about how they actually did things, and they had bigger piles of money to play with anyway, so they didn't have to nickel and dime it the way these guys did. But even today, politicians have had to do things like reject pay rises because they're still afraid of the scandals associated with expenses and stuff. And don't get me wrong, a few of them have always still tried to put forward a motion, but the rest of them have gone, don't you remember what happened last time? So it very quickly dies on its ass. You don't see it back in the news again. So it really has had an impact, and it made people a lot more vigilant over what politicians were doing, and it gave reporters a great way to name and shame if it ever happened again. And it happens in America. Don't think it doesn't. They're stealing shit tons of money off of you, and you don't even realize it. You know, every single one of those flights to and from constituencies in DC, that's on your dime. Every single time a politician goes wandering around the country, that's from congressional funding, some of which is on your dime, and some of which is basically being paid for by a super PAC. The money is the key. And if you follow the money, you'll see how everything's connected. It's
you'll see
very
how
easy.
Connected, but a lot of these things are very torched. Like you can look at a money trail, but only to where the documents end, and to a large extent, that's where a lot of documents end. They end at people who did something that they never want a FOIA for. So, like, there's that too, and then there's the fact that essentially the parliamentary system is just a veneer over it, like the long-term royalty system. And it's the same in the Senate in the US, where the politicians aren't actually acting in a representative interest to the people. They're primarily acting in terms of, like, their own personal interest in keeping the empire stable.
See, I question the whole is how much power the monarchy actually has over the British people.
Well, but
they are. Let me explain, because they are well respected, but in essence, functionally, they serve as a figurehead. They have potentially the authority to completely overrule the government and potentially dissolve Parliament if there was a need to. However, I don't see the British people going, yeah, that's okay, unless the British Parliament had gone completely rogue. Well, and in those situations, it's basically one of those checks and balances, and there's not been a need to. That's the thing. They've not had to deal with it, and they've been less and less in charge of things, and more of a tourist attraction.
Well, right, but okay, so I'm not saying like the crown when I'm talking royalty. I'm talking about like maybe a many-faceted fiefdom where all these parliament heads are fucking essentially feudal lords who are given, control over a certain district, and they get to have this thin veneer of actual debate or conversation on policy, and that can be a thin veneer over a fundamentally unfree society where essentially everybody's still funding people's indiscretions and their huge bourgeoisie sorts of like dining at the table while throwing scraps at the lower classes and the rows. I mean, essentially we're talking about people who have no accountability and no desire for accountability, and that's why the FOIA broke such a scandal in that case. I mean, I didn't know about that, but that's like, it confirms everything that I think about politics. So
well, there's I think there's one last report we can leave on, and that's actually from PolitiFact. So every now and again, you get a gem, and recently on PBS Firing Line, the new she the senator, or is she a congressman for? No, she's a congressman for Queens and Bronx district of New York. Yeah. She's basically come out saying that unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs. Unemployment is low because people are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week and can barely feed their family. Now, I'm just going to quickly interject and say, logically, that isn't how employment stats work. I don't think she means what she thinks she means. And PolitiFact actually completely agrees with me on this. They have set her rating to pants on fire. And here's why. During the interview, Ocasio-Cortez said, unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs. Unemployment is low because people are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week and can barely feed their family. It's at about 5 minutes and 45 seconds in the video within the article. This comment drew criticism from a number of right-leaning outlets, including National Review, Hot Air, Town Hall, and Reason. In our review, we found many reasons why unemployment is low. It's not for the overwork that Ocasio-Cortez cited. The biggest factors include strong economic confidence and the long-running economic recovery. Her campaign didn't respond to an inquiry. Everyone has 2 jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of how many people work 2 jobs rather than 1. Over the past 12 months, the number of multiple job holders has ranged between 6 and 7 million. That compares to more than 148 million Americans who are employed in a single job. So by the official statistics, multiple job holders account for a tiny fraction of the American workers. And this percentage isn't high by historical standards. People hold multiple jobs as a percentage of people employed from 1994 to 2018. It was in 1994 at around 5.5%. It's actually much lower than that now at under 5%. The percentages moved in a pretty narrow band between 4.7 to 5.2 during the recovery from the Great Recession. That range is actually below where it was between 1944 and the Great Recession. In fact, the percentage was at its highest during the peak of the 90s boom. People are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. This assertion is equally dubious. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics breaks down its count of people with multiple jobs into 3 categories. People working 1 full-time job and 1 part-time job, people with 2 part-time jobs, and people working 2 full-time jobs. A worker with 2 full-time jobs is the smallest category of the 3, of which it's at less than 5%. 2 part-time jobs is about 30%, 1 full-time job or 1 part-time job is about 64%. So 2/3 of us will work 1 job of some description. Since the entire pie chart is equivalent to the small red column in the previous graph, the people who might be working 70 or 80 hours a week amount to a tiny percentage of a tiny percentage. 310,000 people at most in a pool of employed Americans totaling more than 150 million. It's also worth noting that, on average, Americans aren't working more today than they have been in the recent past. The average number of hours in the private sector has hugged tightly to about 34.5 hours a week since 2006, except for a dip during the Great Depression, or recession even. So why is unemployment low? When the BLS determines the unemployment rate, a person is counted as employed as long as they have at least 1 job. They don't get counted twice if they have 2 jobs. So, Osaya-Cortez is wrong saying multiple job holding and long hours affect unemployment rates. It's worth remembering that both of the factors Osaya-Cortez cited, people working multiple jobs and long hours, are actually good things for the labor market, said Gary Burtless, an economist at the Brookings Institution. Quote, the increased number of multiple job holders and longer average work hours almost always accompany a strengthening labor market. That is, a job market in which it's easier to find work, in which spells of unemployment are heading downwards, and in which the ranks of the unemployed are shrinking, Burles said. Our ruling. Osaya-Cortez said unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs. Unemployment is low because people are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week and can barely feed their family. Even taking into account rhetorical excess, the statement is off in multiple ways. Fewer than 1 in 20 people employed Americans hold a second job of any type. And people who might be working as much as 70 or 80 hours a week represent a tiny fraction of that tiny fraction. The rates for either statistic are not high by historical standards. In any case, the BLS does not use either of those factors in determining the official employment rate. We rate the statement pants on fire. So, yeah, it looks like PolitiFact didn't actually pull any punches on that one and completely lambasted Cortez for being, wrong on every single level, both empirically and logically. You cannot be more wrong.
Well, and of course, it doesn't help that, everybody was already making jokes about the fact that she was trying to pull the Bronx card and she didn't even work, really.
So she hasn't even really been in that situation herself, has she?
Likely not, but it wouldn't surprise me if she's just seen enough people working very hard that she assumed it was like that countrywide, and she assumed that was the reason, and she assumed the numbers. So she might not be a liar, liar, pants on fire. She might just be a dumb who's dumb.
Well, like I said, the logic alone qualifies it as just a lie, because there's no way to say that employment is impacted by how many jobs are worked or how long the hours are. It's impacted by how many people there are compared to how many people are employed. Doesn't matter how many, it's not based on the number of jobs, it's based on the number of people. And it's that level of basic, misunderstanding of the analysis that just makes me cringe for the people of New York in particular. It's like, you elected this person to serve your interests.
Possibly. I mean, we can't see, and this is the thing, we're about to wrap this up, so I think this is a good way to do it. It's good to remember that this week alone, We've gone over the fact that voting machines have been tampered with, and that you know they had remote access software installed as well. It's good to remember that the cop we talked about earlier this week was living off of fucking taxpayer dollars in his fucking beach house. It's good to remember that politicians don't have your interests at heart and aren't hired by you or representative of you. And it's good to remember that all of these people are very good examples of what happens when people don't pay attention to what's at the head of the table.
Here, here.
So,
Bit of self-responsibility, people. Get rid of your politicians and start running things for yourself.
yeah, and on
You
Monday,
can't screw it up worse than they are, I swear.
and on Monday, I'm going to bring up the town that lost that completely jettisoned all of their government and all of their politicians, and now basically try to govern themselves. And they seem to be doing a relatively good job of it. So I'll be bringing out that essentially minarchist utopia in Mexico
Fair enough.
next Monday.
That sounds like a good one.
We'll be reading a couple stories on it. So
Might be a good idea to add in the city in Texas that's fully privatized its police force and
and
some stories
Detroit.
on Detroit. Yeah, I was about to say DTM.
yeah, and by the way, if anybody wants to, Threat Management Center is always willing to talk about their policies on Twitter, so you all should follow them. Anyway, this has been Bad Morning News, a bad morning to all of you, or if you're in Britain, a bad evening, I guess. But, you know, you can listen to this tomorrow morning and realize that everything still sucks when you wake up. So, a bad morning to y'all, and I hope you have a bad morning and a bad day. Be well.
Bad morning to you all.